When I was around the ages of 12 to 13, I would often be left home alone after school. My parents and my younger sisters normally didn't arrive home for about an hour and a half. I normally didn't mind being alone at all. I could eat whatever I wanted, watch TV at a loud volume without being yelled at, and yell about how shitty my day was to my friends on FaceTime without being interrupted. On that particular day, I walked in the door and dropped my bags. All I wanted to do was eat a fresh bowl of mac and cheese and cry. I was exhausted, so I got to doing just that. As soon as I began to boil the water, I heard the unmistakable sound of somebody wearing big, heavy snow boots walking around downstairs. I knew it couldn't have been anybody in my family because my father, who was always the first one home besides me, wouldn't be home for another hour. Even if he had gotten home early, he would have messaged me, and I would have clearly heard the garage door open. To stop myself from panicking, I told myself that the washing machine was most likely uneven, and I should go and check on it. I turned the stove off, and just in case somebody was breaking in, I grabbed a giant kitchen knife and went downstairs. The washing machine or the dryer wasn't even running. My brain basically froze. I stood in front of the stairway for a good minute, trying to figure out what I had heard, trying to put some kind of calming explanation behind it. All of a sudden, the room went freezing cold, and I felt somebody standing behind me. When whoever this was breathed down my neck, it was over. I sprinted up the stairs, not only hearing footsteps behind me, but also hearing heavy breathing. When I got to the top of the stairs, I remembered I was holding a knife. I spun around to teach this motherfucker not to go into people's houses. And when I did, nobody was there. I assumed that the intruder had retreated downstairs, so I locked myself in the bathroom and messaged my dad. He told me to stay put and not to make any loud sounds. When I asked him if I should call 911, he said no. There I sat, in the bathroom, trying not to cry, because my worst nightmare had finally come true. All of a sudden, I heard the sound of heavy boots again, but this time, they were walking up the stairs. I quickly messaged my dad to see if he was home, and he said no. I felt my stomach drop as the footsteps came closer and closer until they were right at the door. I covered my mouth with my hand, but that still didn't cover the sound of my heavy breathing due to the sheer panic. I could see the shadow of this person's feet in the crack underneath the door. I could hear him breathing on the door. I stood there, silencing my cries, tears rushing down my face. I was horrified. All of a sudden, I heard my dad's garage door open. A rush of relief filled my body. I heard the intruder run into my parents' room. My dad checked the entire house. There was nothing. No broken windows, all the doors were locked, and of course, there was no intruder. The only thing that was wrong, what's in the basement? It was trashed. When my mother had cleaned it that day, my dad joked about how it was just my imagination. He said that I was just paranoid. To this day, I still can't explain it. I know what I heard. I know what I felt. When I was around the age of 8 or 9, my grandmother invited my sister and I to have a sleepover at her house. To summarize the day, it was like any other time with my grandparents. We went shopping, played soccer in the backyard, drew on the patio with chalk, and overall, we had a very good time. When the day finally came to an end and I had to go to sleep, I didn't even think twice about it. I was exhausted after a long day of playing with my grandmother and my sister. I slept in my uncle's old room down the hall, while my sister slept on the couch in the living room. Everything was normal, until I felt somebody in the room. I've always been able to pick up on other people's energy and tell if someone is in the room with me. I thought that my sister had had a nightmare and was going to talk to me about it. So I rolled over to make contact with her, but what I saw wasn't my sister. It was a very tall man who was staring at me. His arms were crossed, and overall, his body posture was very angry and upset. At first I thought it was my grandfather, but I realised almost immediately afterwards that the man in my doorframe was much taller than my grandfather. I got out of bed and walked over to this figure to find out that this absolutely wasn't my grandpa. This man's face was completely different. The way this man glared at me scared me so much, I ran right through him, screaming and crying to my grandmother. Flash forward a few years later, when I was around the age of 12. My grandmother went through a whole box of vintage pictures, explaining who they were, when she got to one photo in particular. Immediately, the young man in the photo caused me to have a flashback to that sleepover. When I asked who it was, she started crying and said it was her dad, and that he had died very young. This was right around when I was entering 8th grade. I remember all the events vividly, like it happened yesterday. The house we had was amazing. It was a huge one-story house. The backyard was massive, bordering a riverbed. There was a huge metal shed in the back that looked like it was used to work on semi-trucks. It was a 4-bedroom house. Although my brother's room, which was technically a den, was converted to a room, it had long corridors to get to other parts of the house. The kitchen was long, like a hall lined with counters. To get to the 3 bedrooms on the other side of the house, we had to pass the living room and then walk down the long hallway that was L-shaped. My mother's room was at the end of the long hallway, which is where most of the worst events happened. I only know what my other siblings and parents encounter because they told me as an adult. Where before, they didn't want to scare me, because I also had my own experiences. It started with small things like uneasy feelings, weird smells like baby powder, misplaced objects, knocking on doors early in the mornings. But the first major incident was when my uncle lived with us. We were sitting in the living room and we had one of those old school big screen TVs. You know, the ones that basically took up the whole corner of the room. There was my uncle's phone on top charging. Keep in mind, this is a flat surface as my mom had decorations on top of the TV. We were watching TV when suddenly we all watched the phone light up the corner of the room super bright with just the screen. Before my uncle could move to check it, it flew off the TV. I don't mean like it slid, it legit flew. We all got startled. My mom came running from the kitchen and my uncle, who was in his 30s at the time, explains exactly what happened. In shock, he said, "No one touched it. It lit up bright, then frickin' flew off the TV." We all kind of brushed it off, but it was nonetheless the first event of many. The next event kind of jumps from harmless to major. My brother was in the kitchen washing his plate for breakfast. Suddenly, he explains his dreadful feeling, but he said he ignored it. As he was standing there, he said it felt like a gust of wind passed behind him. He even said he felt a tug on his shirt. Thinking it was one of our many siblings, he spun around to see who was there, but there was no one. He was alone, kind of freaked out. He told my mum what happened since she's the most spiritual out of all of us. She's a big Christian. Stay with me, because we're kind of jumping around in the timeliness based on harmless encounters to the worst ones. I remember getting ready for school one morning, and I began to feel anxious and had dreadful feelings. I began to scan my room as I tied my shoes on the chair facing the doorway. I caught a glimpse of an all-black hand wrap around the doorframe of my room. I jumped back, and I saw an all-black face peer from the corner of my doorframe. Its face was pasty black. Its eyes were all black, and it was wearing an old feather hat. I jumped up and screamed, and it quickly disappeared from the doorway. My mom came running in, and I explained with tears in my eyes about what I had seen. She didn't play it off, and started to pray with me. This is my last experience in this house, although my other siblings continued to have things happen. It was my bedtime, and I shared a room with my older brother. I didn't like sleeping alone after seeing whatever that thing was that was watching me tie my shoes. My brother had a late bedtime because he was in high school. I would go to bed first, alone. I remember being scared, but falling asleep. I awoke to a silent, dark room. I couldn't move. I looked around the room from my top bunk bed. We had these huge glass mirrors for closet doors. In the reflection, I watched a creature crawl out from under the bed and hop up onto the bottom bunk, where my brother was sleeping. It was staring at me and it had piercing red eyes. The only way I could explain it was as an evil monkey. I began to scream and cry because I couldn't move. My brother began to wake up. This thing hops off my brother's bed and quickly goes under the bed. My brother jumps up and turns on the lights. I explained what happened as I could move and talk now. He went to get my mom. I remember being terrified that he left me alone in the room to get my mom. She came in and we prayed and I went to bed. After a few years, we moved out of this house. I was happy, as it could be because all the experiences ended once we moved. I remember being in high school. My school friend told me that he had just moved across the street. He explained the house, and it was the same one. I warned him, and he laughed and said nothing has happened yet. A few weeks later, he came up to me and said, "Okay, I believe you. I was in the fridge getting milk this morning. No one was home, just me. And someone came super close to my ear. I could feel their breath on my neck and said in a low, deep voice, 'What are you doing here?' Through the school year, he would tell me all the things that happened, which in turn were way worse than what we experienced. I'll preface this by saying that I grew up in a household that was equal parts traumatic and spiritually active. My mum was very sensitive to the other side, and so ghosts, spirits, shadow people, etc. were normalized everyday occurrences in our house. We always had shadows that would run past, just out the corner of our eye. But when I was 15, I encountered a different type of shadow. My bedroom had two doors, one to the main living area, and the other to a Jack and Jill bathroom. The bathroom door was directly across from the head of my bed. One night, the summer I turned 15, I woke up in the middle of the night because I felt like someone was in the room with me. I opened my eyes to see an outline of a tall man, as tall as a door frame, walking from the living room door to the bathroom door. There, he leaned against it and seemed to fold his arms, and I could feel him watching me. It was a very cold feeling, almost clinic, but with a darker edge, if that makes any sense. This happened often. Every time, it was the same routine. Some nights he felt angry, some nights just cold, and some nights downright deadly. But it was never a comforting feeling, which contradicted what everyone said to calm me down, that it must have been someone looking to protect me. Anyways, I'm 30 now. I've moved houses at least 7 times, and I still occasionally see him watching me. So I finally decided to look into it. I found stories of the Hat Man and people connecting him to childhood trauma or moments of high negative emotions. And I thought back, and I realised he started appearing right after one of the most traumatic things I've experienced to date. And even now, he seems to pop up when I'm going through it, as they say. But I don't see the hat, and I can't remember ever seeing him with a hat. Everything else is pretty much spot on. I was at the park with the kids, 11 and 8, and my dog, a 45-pound Dutch Shepherd. The park equipment has a 4-foot fence around the whole thing. The sidewalk leads from a dock to the parking lot, with the fenced-in park on the left. The entrance to the park is on the opposite side from the parking lot, closest to the dock. Me and the kids were walking towards the truck to leave, and saw an older man and woman get out of their car, which was parked directly beside my truck. Both dressed very nicely, Sunday dress. The woman walked to the bathrooms, and the man walked towards the fence in the kids' park. I glanced behind me to make sure the kids were on my heels, and I shit you not, within the 2 seconds that I glanced behind me on the look back for the man, he was already on the swing and swinging. The kids immediately looked at me, and my daughter said, "That man is so strange." He was laughing and swinging and looked in my direction. And in a friendly pass-by, I just said, "The swings don't swing as high as they used to." And he replied something along the lines of, "And they weren't as squeaky either." I got to the truck like 4 or 5 seconds later, turned my head to check for him again, and he was gone. And the swing was just violently swinging as if he jumped off it and vanished. I hurried the kids into the truck and walked the dog around to my side, which was directly beside their vehicle. They weren't there. They weren't in the park, nowhere to be seen. When I drove off, I asked the kids if they thought that whole interaction was weird, and they immediately said yes. Not sure who those people were or how the hell they moved so fast and apparently just vanished, but it felt like an odd glitch in the Matrix, and it's been on my mind for a few days. When I was a child, I didn't really care about getting new video games for presents, or the least flashy toys. Here was one thing I wanted above everything else: a pair of light-up shoes. Looking back on it, it feels a little silly. I desired them so much. A classmate owned a pair, and the moment I saw his steps flashing, I focused on nothing else. I started doing chores to try and save up money for a pair of shoes. I begged my parents for them, with no luck. I'd just gotten a new pair of shoes before I found out the light-up ones existed. We weren't well off, but we weren't poor either. They didn't believe in buying another pair of shoes when I already had a perfectly good pair. They promised they would think about getting the ones I wanted after the first set got worn out. To a child, that felt like forever. My last pair of shoes lasted an entire year, and I didn't want to wait that long. When my classmate found out about how much I wanted his shoes, he playfully teased me about them. His teasing was never anything serious. A few months later, our class turned on him and said some pretty awful things because he was adopted. I joined in, still bitter about the shoes. I regret what I said and apologised for my words shortly after. He felt hurt by my actions, but forgave me. In the back of my mind, I had a feeling if I acted kind to him, he might just give me the shoes, because he really didn't care one way or the other about them. We became friends because we lived so close to each other. When I went to his place, I saw that his father would buy him anything he wanted. You would think that would turn him a bit spoiled, but somehow he acted pretty down to earth. My childhood friend gladly shared whatever snacks I wanted, or let me borrow any toys my family could not afford. I was so thankful he forgave me for my bullying. I did my best to be respectful with him. But he refused to give up the shoes. I think the reason why I coveted them so badly was they were just within my reach. I saw them every day, and they didn't cost an insane amount. That desire, and a mixture of child stupidity, led me to do something I'll always regret. I decided to steal the shoes. My chance came when he said his family was going to be gone for a weekend. My heart raced as I thought about my plan. I knew where his house key was hidden. I could just walk in and take them when they were gone. In my room, there was a pair of floorboards I could remove and hide stuff inside. My parents didn't even know about the hiding spot. I could stash the shoes there. This all would work if he didn't take the shoes along with him. He had been wearing them less and less, so there was a good chance of them being left behind. I didn't even want to wear them. I just wanted the damn thing so bad. I casually walked down the street towards his house, telling my parents that I wanted to go to the store to buy cheap candy. I saw him get into the family's car with a wave when he spotted me down the street. Before I reached their house, they were long gone. I wasn't going to break into their place in the daylight hours. I would wait until dark. My stomach doing flip-flops over the thought of the crime I was going to commit. When night did come, I nearly backed out of the whole thing. After talking myself into how easy it would be, I crept out of the house for a short walk to his place. My body tensed with stress. I thought every neighbour was watching me. Slowly, I went up the stairs, looking around expecting to see a neighbour to stop me at any moment. I would prefer to the back door, but didn't know where the key would be hidden. The front door was kept under a happy frog. They really should move it from such an obvious spot. The lock sounded like a bomb going off as I put the key inside and turned it. Holding my breath, I opened the door just enough to slip inside. I shut it behind me as quietly as I possibly could. No one would be home, and yet I didn't want to risk someone hearing or seeing me. The place is dark, but there's enough light from the streetlight to see it. I'd hoped the shoes would be by the front door. As I got down low to look through the shoe rack, I heard something, a noise coming from inside the house. I nearly passed out from fear. My friend didn't own any pets. It was the one thing his parents never let him have. I strained to try and hear better. When I didn't hear anything again, I went back to looking, disappointed when I didn't see the pair of shoes. There's a good chance he kept them in his room. I've seen him run through the house to go to the washroom the moment he got home, to kick his shoes off in his room when he was finished. I look in there, then leave. As I silently made my way towards the stairs, I heard the sound again. It sounded like a voice. I was sure of it. I should have run. I shouldn't have ever gone there. The hint of the sound came again, and I followed it. My feet cracked the floorboards as I went. If someone was home, I could be caught. But this sounds almost like a hurt puppy. I needed to figure out what was going on. The soft whining came from the basement door. My palms were sweating as I stared at the closed door, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to leave a suffering animal behind, but if the animal was too badly hurt, I would need to call an adult for help. I would just go down and see what I could do. The basement had windows, so maybe some sort of animal got inside and got hurt somewhere. Gathering all my courage, I opened the door and made my way down the old wooden steps. There was a light on somewhere in the basement. Did they forget to turn it off when they left? It wasn't enough to fill the entire room, but I could see where to walk. The basement floor is a cold cement that muffled my footsteps. The ceiling was exposed and covered with cobweb, making my skin crawl at the sight. I was told this is where my friend's father stored all his tools and other stuff. We weren't allowed down there. His parents claimed it to be too messy and a bit dangerous with sharp objects on the shelves. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I looked around. Tall shelving crammed the space. The place was dusty, as if none of these tools were ever used, and each looked pretty different from one another. I didn't know what his father did to need such a large arrangement of things. Maybe he bought and sold them, something from every trade down here on the shelves. I could hear the whining sound better now. As I walked between shelves, I did my best not to get caught on anything sticking out. Just as I turned the corner, I froze when the sound turned into a word. Someone begged for help. I almost fainted from how scared I felt. Someone was down here, not an animal like I first assumed. I could peek between the clutter into the open space beyond, instead of walking around the shelf. What I saw made my mouth dry. In that dingy basement, a man sat, strapped down to a chair. Someone I've never seen before. Tears stained his face, and the tips of his fingers bloody. It took me a second to realise the blood came from the fact that his fingernails were missing. I took a step back when another figure came into view. I couldn't risk moving and being heard. I stayed, watching the horrible scene play out. You're really making this harder on yourself. If you just give me the names of your friends, we could end this. My heart nearly stopped when I recognised that upbeat tone. It was my friend's father, the kind man I've come to respect. His hands were stained with blood as he set down some pliers on a table next to the chair. I choked on my fear, but still didn't move. Please, I don't know them. I gave you everything I had. We just exchanged some videos, that's all. I'm not the one recording them. I don't deserve this. I'd never seen a grown man cry before. His captor let him sob for a few moments until he got on his level. Eye to eye, his tone dropped down, disgusted with the man he tortured. Those were children in those videos. You supported that. You've earned far more pain than I can give. If you have no names for me, you're useless. Reaching over, he plucked a pair of long scissors and a clamp from the table. His back was facing me, so I didn't know what his expression looked like at that moment. This person is no longer the kind father I've gotten to know, but a monster. The other man thrashed, trying to get away as the clamp came down on one of his fingers, the scissors hovering ominously in the air. The moment before the blades came down, the man cracked. Through sobs, he started to list email addresses and online names. His captor paused to write down what was being said, acting so calm over the whole thing. He even took all the passwords from the man accounts so we could investigate further. It felt like ages as the sobbing man listed off names and numbers. My feet hurt from standing for so long, and my body trembled from fear. After he got everything he could, the father started to cut the tape, keeping the man bound. He warned if he made for a run for it, he would kill him. The other person was too shocked to move. Even after his hands were cut, he didn't believe he could go free. I swear, I won't ever watch those kinds of videos again. I won't even go near another kid until I die, he sobbed, still in the chair. Let me tell you something. I didn't care about children for a long time. I could kill one without a second thought. It wasn't until I settled down into this life I changed my focus on what kind of lives I took. And I need to take them, because I'm very hungry. Oh, so very hungry. Unable to hold back a scream, I yelped when the father's face twisted and changed. Looking no longer human, but some sort of beast with a face that's mostly made of jaws. My scream was drowned out by the other man. He got up and tripped over the chair before the monster caught him. Those jaws tearing into his flesh, taking chunks off the body and causing blood to fly everywhere. I heard the sounds of that man being eaten alive. I curled up against the shelf, so scared I couldn't move. I just sobbed, wanting to go home and regretting my choices. As the sounds died down, I knew I'd been caught. I should have been the one eaten next. A hand landed on my shoulder and I screamed, completely out of my mind. The hand stayed until I calmed down enough to face the father. His human face was stained with blood and silver eyes staring down at me in the dark. Sweetheart, what are you doing here? He asked in a sweet tone that made me sick. I broke, sobbing, and explained why I broke in. It was all because of those damn shoes. I kept apologizing for breaking into his place and swearing I would never tell a soul of what I saw. He laughed at the small, frantic child sobbing in front of him. In fact, he laughed so hard he choked. Wiping tears from his eyes, he lifted me to my feet to usher me out of the basement. You're adorable. Don't worry about anything happening to you. I promise not to tell anyone you broke in. If you promise not to tell your parents about what you saw tonight. I nodded, unable to speak. I would never be able to bring this up to them. I expected him to simply walk me out of the door, but he quickly washed his face and changed his clothing. My parents noticed their child missing and went to the street calling my name. He walked over, a small scared child in his hand. He said I'd gone to the store for a snack run, but got lost. By chance, he'd come across me and brought me home. Somehow, my parents believed him. He gave us a wave as I was carried by my father back home. He watched, smiling, hiding a dark secret only I knew. A few months passed by. My friends still wanted to hang out with me, but I couldn't bring myself to go to his place. I could tell he didn't have a clue on what his adopted father kept hidden. At least he would be safe with that monster. He broke the news to his family he would be moving before the winter. I was going to miss him, even after everything. Before we left, he showed up at my place with a box. Since we weren't going to see each other at Christmas, he wanted to give me my gift early. I felt totally puzzled at what could be inside. I tore off the delicate red wrapping paper and opened the box. My breath caught when I saw a pair of new light-up shoes tucked inside tissue paper. My friend was completely unaware of why the sight of them made my face turn pale. I did my best to act natural and thanked him for the thoughtful gift. After he left, I hid those shoes away, never to touch them or even take them out of the box. Since then, I've never coveted something to such an extent, and my life is much better for it. When I was 13, my grandma passed away. Over the last few years, I've had many experiences, some bad and some good. The biggest was when my 2-year-old excitedly ran into my kitchen yelling, "Your grandma is here!" When I asked, who? Thinking, of course, she meant my living grandma. She walked back into the living room, got into my face and said, "It's Nadine." Now, the only issue with this is at this point in time, she hadn't really been told much of anything about my grandma Nadine, so I had no clue how she would knew to do this. Recently, a few other things have happened. Always when I've been having a hard time, ask my grandma to please watch over me. Well, the other night, I was in the car and began having major anxiety about driving. I asked out loud this time for Grandma to watch over me, and my car radio shut itself off. I turned it back on since the music helps relax me while I drive. It immediately had the volume go all the way up. I turned it down, and then it went all the way down. Thought it was a malfunction, so I just turned it back off. A few minutes later, my anxiety was getting so bad, I had to pull over. When I was parked at the side of the road, the music turned back on, and I realized it was the Eagles' Hotel California. This was my grandma's favorite song. So I told my mom, and she said she believes it was my grandma letting me know she was watching over, and that I would be okay. As for the part about my radio going crazy, my mom reminded me my grandma, as sweet as she was also a kind of prankster and thinks grandma was messing with me. In the past, I was quite the skeptic when it came to the paranormal. I wasn't one of those jerk skeptics who would tell people to grow up or ridicule them. I enjoyed listening to ghost stories. Some I thought were more believable than others. For instance, I found the ones where people saw, heard and felt things more believable than stories in which people were badly hurt, killed, or property damage was done. Still, as I enjoy the stories, I always took them with a grain of salt. Though as I have had more strange experiences, I took more ghost stories seriously than before. Well, not the super crazy ones. The very first strange thing that I ever experienced was when I was about 6 years old. I was at my babysitter's house, and one day I was walking down the hall and the door to the restroom was wide open. I looked inside and everything was fine. I went back to walking and then heard a noise. When I went back to the restroom, I saw a drawer had opened, so I ran back to the living room. When I was 11 years old, I had this constant feeling that there was someone in the apartment my family and I lived in. During the morning and afternoon, I would be distracted with schoolwork, family, friends, TV, etc. Though once night comes, the distractions and noise dwindle. You're able to focus and notice things more. When my family was home or I was alone, I always felt like there was this person in a white robe roaming the halls at night. One day, I was alone, and the feeling got so bad, I stayed outside on a cold November night for 2 hours, until my family came back home. I don't know if it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but from the porch, I was able to see into the window. I saw the curtains moving as if someone walked past them. What's even more strange is that I got that feeling once more, but instead of feeling as if it was someone in a robe, I felt like there was a man lurking around. It happened earlier this year. My grandpa passed away, and my family went to Mexico for the funeral. I had to stay home due to being in college. I was all alone, and in those 2 weeks they were away, I was paranoid. I would stay awake all night in the living room with all the lights on in the room. I constantly had this feeling that there was a man wandering from room to room. And I would think I heard doors creak open or close. In the morning, when the noise of people filled the air, I would check the rooms and find nothing amiss. Now this story is the reason I went from skeptic to believer. The rest I had thought was due to me being paranoid, either because I was a kid or due to losing someone close. This one though, I had no explanation for it. In 2020, I took a year off due to an error with my transfer to a school. I decided to work and got a chill job as a janitor. I enjoyed my time there. I had to clean 4 clinics with a 3-person crew, and each clinic was 30 to 40 minutes apart. The only problem was that the people I worked with at the time were not reliable. 2 times, I had to clean all floor clinics on my own because multiple people did not show up for work. My first strange experience in this job happened at Clinic C. It was placed near a creepy alley and in a small town where the activity dies at night. While cleaning, I constantly heard a dripping noise. I went to the sink I thought was making the noise and looked under it, looking for a leak. Nothing. I stayed a while to try and pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Again, nothing. I shrugged and went back to cleaning, and then when I left the room where the noise was coming from, it started again. My final experience happened on a Thursday, a day before my last day there. It was at the biggest clinic, D. It had both clinical and dental services. There were a lot of stories on how the nurses would hear things. They said they could hear a lady scream, and one day I closed a door to a restroom and realized it made a loud shriek whenever you closed it. So I assumed that was the noise they kept hearing. Another day they said they would hear a loud clatter. One day there was a silver tray for the doctor to put his tools on. One of the legs holding up the tray was flimsy and it would constantly fall. So I assumed that was the noise they heard. As me and my co-workers were finishing up, one of them and I were waiting for the final co-worker to finish mopping. We were in the large lobby connected to the dental lobby as well. There's a glass door in the lobby that lets you see directly down a vertical hall to a horizontal hall that leads to a patient rooms, a lab, and to the dental area. The floor was wet and most of the lights were off. My co-worker asked me something and I looked at her and responded. Then I looked back at the hall and I saw a pair of legs walking around past a wall towards the lab or door to enter the dental area. I called for the mopping co-worker. We all know not to walk on the wet floor, but she may have forgotten and walked on it. Though she answered from behind me. She was finishing up mopping the entrance to the lobby. I then went out to the left of the lobby, down a dry hall which connected to the horizontal hall I saw the legs walking in. I looked down the hall and saw no footprints on the floor. The legs had sneakers like the nurses wear and black scrubs like they wear as well. I told my co-workers and they both said they heard nothing and saw nobody else in the large building. I told my mom when I got home about what had happened and she gave me her input. She said that since a lot of people go to the clinic, one of them might be carrying a spirit, good or bad. That spirit may have gotten attached to the place and stayed behind. She could see I was shaken by this experience and tried to cheer me up. It worked, and I acted like I wasn't affected by it. But I was, and to this day, I don't know what I saw. It was more than likely the one making the noises heard, and it was real. I know it was. When I was a kid, I lived in a haunted house. I'll preface this by saying I'm generally a very rational person, and I'm a skeptic by nature. I didn't grow up in a family that was religious or into the supernatural, and if I hadn't experienced these things myself, there's no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't believe in it today. Our house was built in 1912. On the outside, it seemed like a totally normal house. The moment I stepped inside that house, I felt uneasy and couldn't explain why. My sister and I shared a room upstairs. I was sitting on my bed in my room one day, facing the doorway. It was one of those accordion doors that would click closed, and there was a space of about 2 feet at the bottom where it didn't reach the floor. It was only my mom and I home at the time, and she was downstairs. I heard the floor creak outside my door in the hallway, as though someone was walking into my room. Then I saw a white mist-type figure pass by my door. At first I thought it was my mom bringing laundry upstairs, and I waited for her feet to peer under the door, but they didn't. I went and peeked under my door to see who was in the hallway, and there was nobody there. There was no wind, and no way it could have been a curtain blowing. I definitely saw something pass by my door. Another day, I was in my room alone again. My family was downstairs in the kitchen at the time. There was a wardrobe by the door that had a lamp on top of it. I was just sitting on my bed again, and all of a sudden, the lamp started to violently rock back and forth. It scared the shit out of me, so I immediately ran downstairs, and my family could see I was scared and asked me what was wrong. I told them what happened, and they all looked at each other. I discovered later they tried to protect me from knowing any of the paranormal experiences that happened there. Another day, my sister and I were in the living room. It was summer, and we had one of those window air conditioners in the kitchen window. My dad was just finishing building a detached garage outside and had turned the breaker off so we could finish wiring the electrical to the garage. There was no electricity at all in the house. We were just sitting there, and all of a sudden, we heard the air conditioner turn on. My sister and I looked at each other and ran outside. My parents asked us what was wrong, and we told them how the air conditioner turned on by itself. My dad said that's impossible. There's no electricity going to the house. We had no explanation for how it turned on. Another day, I was in my room, and we had one of those big fans that sat on the floor. My sister would always yell at me for leaving it on when I wasn't in the room. On this day, it was really hot, so I purposefully left the fan on. I went downstairs to have a shower. Only my mum and sister were home at the time. I came back up to my room, and the fan had switched off. I immediately felt uneasy because I knew I had left it on. I asked my mum and sister if they had gone upstairs while I was in the shower, but they hadn't. No explanation for how it turned off. This was back in the days where we would record songs off the radio on cassette tapes. One day, I guess I forgot to press stop while recording and had left the room. When I listened back, it sounded like a man and woman arguing on the tape but couldn't quite make out what they were saying. There was no one in the room at the time. When I would go to sleep at night and the lights were out, I would see what I now know were probably orbs, but at the time, I had no idea what it was. It was like static electricity in the air. I don't know how to explain it. The closest thing I've ever seen to it are sparklers. It used to scare the shit out of me, and I would run to my mom's room to tell her, and she would say, "Oh, it's just your eyes playing tricks on you. Don't pay attention to it." I would go back to bed and hide my head under the covers. There was a spirit that would stand in the corner of my room and watch us constantly. After we moved, I told my mom one day that our new house felt so much happier than our old one. She asked me what I meant. I told her how our old house had such a heavy atmosphere and felt totally different, and I always felt like I was being watched. I asked her if it was haunted, and she finally admitted to me that it had been, and they had tried to protect me from it because I was the youngest. I described two of the ghosts to her. The female that was always in the corner of my room, and the male spirit that stayed in my brother's room. I described the time period they were from and how they were dressed. The woman was in a long dark dress, and the man sat on the floor in my brother's room and looked out the window. No idea how I knew these things, and it turned out I was pretty close, except for the woman who wore a black veil that hid her face, and the man actually had no legs, which is why I thought he was sitting all the time. When we lived there, I had a reoccurring dream where I saw a little girl in a white nightgown cowering in the hallway outside my bedroom and crying because the house was on fire. I was constantly paranoid about fires while living in that house and would constantly check the electrical outlets through the house to be sure everything was okay. After we moved, I worked at our local library and there were tons of resources about the history of the town. Turns out, before our old house was built at that location, there was a hotel that used to stand there in the late 1800s that had burned to the ground, killing several people. My dad was the only one who didn't have experiences while we lived there. My mum had the most experiences, and I think at first, she started to think that she was losing her mind. It wasn't until my siblings and I started to tell him about our experience, and specifically me, with the lamp incident in my room, that he started to think something was wrong with the house. My brother worked late nights and would get home around midnight. He would walk through the dark house to get to his room and would often hear someone calling his name. He thought it was our mom and would go into her room to see what she wanted, only to find her asleep. Eventually, he would rarely sleep there. He would sleep at his friends' or girlfriends' houses instead. My sister and I shared a room. We had a female ghost dressed in black veil who would stand and watch us in the corner of our room. One night, my sister woke up to find someone sitting beside her on a bed, holding her hand. She thought it was me and asked what I was doing. No answer. She looked over at my bed. I was there, sound asleep. She looked back, and the figure was gone. To this day, she sleeps with her head under the covers and her arms tucked under her. My mum had multiple experiences. I'm not even aware of all of them, and honestly, don't want to know. I know she said there were at least 5 spirits in the house, plus others that would pass through. In our basement, we had an old cold room, and this apparently is where the spirit portal was located in our house. Not sure why it was there, or how it got there, but I think previous residents had dabbled in things they shouldn't have. As I said previously, there was a hotel that had burned down on that location, killing several people. I think previous residents could sense the presence of these spirits and dabbled with Ouija boards or seances to contact the spirits and ended up inviting dark entities. Just a theory, but I believe people who lived there before us made the situation worse. My mom is very sensitive to spirits and had experiences with all of them, I think. The woman in black was a protective spirit and would communicate with my mom quite a bit. I believe that spirit protected me from the other spirits. My mom was walking down to the basement one day, and she lost her footing and started to fall. She suddenly felt hands on her chest and pushed her back to an upright position. She never saw anyone, just felt them catch her as well. Another day she was vacuuming in my brother's room when the phone rang. She ran downstairs to answer it, and while she was downstairs, she heard the vacuum start up and be pushed across the floor. She ran back upstairs, but by the time she got there, it had stopped. She was the only one home at the time. We had so many issues with phantom calls in that house. This is before cell phones, so we only had a landline. The phone would ring constantly, and nobody would be on the line. Or we would hear static, or as though there was a muffled voice on the line, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. I don't know how many times we had the phone company come to check it out, only to find nothing wrong. Then it escalated. My dad would get up to leave for work in the middle of the night, and just after he would leave, we would get a call where the person would say, "I saw you leave for work." This freaked my mum right out, so the police became involved to try and trace where these calls were coming from. We had to keep track of the time the calls came in, what was said, etc. They were never able to trace the calls. We moved shortly after and had the same phone number. The calls stopped as soon as we moved out, and we never had any issues again. Before we moved, my mum was really worried that they would follow us. The woman in black was very religious, and my mum had an old Bible beside her bed. One morning, she woke up to find the Bible open beside her on the nightstand, and these words were highlighted: "And this house will be my home forever." Thankfully, they didn't follow us. I'm very sensitive to spirits and have had other experiences throughout my life. That'll be for another day. I hated that house and was so happy to move. I'm grateful for the experience though, because now I know our spirits do continue on after death, just in a different way. I don't typically see spirits in the traditional sense. I've seen a couple physically in front of me, but the vast majority I see in my mind. I get a mental image of them, and I also can often sense their emotions at that time. Sometimes they try to communicate, but it's all telepathically. When I was in university, I was trying to find a class. The building I was in was old, and the room was supposed to be on the second floor. I went up the stairs, and as I walked towards one room in particular, I suddenly could see in my mind a soldier. He had short dark hair and was dressed in an old-fashioned green uniform. He had a bayonet in his hand and was charging me. He was very upset I was there and was yelling at me. It scared the shit out of me. I turned and ran back down the stairs and ran out of the building. Months later, I had to go in the building again. I noticed a plaque embedded in the wall that said the building was dedicated to the soldiers who died in World War I. I had a part-time job at a conference centre. Part of the building was an old house, and there was a story that it was haunted by a man. All I knew at the time is that some employees who worked the front desk had reported seeing him over the years. One day, I was near the area where he had been seen before, and I had a mental image of the man. He was older, maybe in his 50s, and was dressed in what looked like old work clothes. He was balding and missing teeth. He reached into his pocket and showed me a pocket watch and smiled, as though he was amused. In my mind, it's like a camera zooming in and it zooms in on the pocket watch. Then he put it back in his pocket and turned and walked away. After this, I was curious about the ghost story there, and I looked into the man who supposedly haunts it. Turns out, he was accused of stealing a pocket watch and was hanged at the gallows that at the time of his death had been located across the street. At one point, I was looking for a new place to live. There was an ad for a small bachelor apartment located near a friend of mine in an old house. When I went to look at the place, I could feel the spirit from the street. I still went in to take a look at the place, but I knew even before I walked in the door that I couldn't live there. The spirit there was a very stern Victorian woman. She was in a purple dress, and she really didn't like me. She stood in the room the entire time, looking at me disapprovingly while I was there looking at the place. The ad was for a sublet, and the woman who lived there currently was acting a bit weird, like she was desperate to get out of that place. I don't think the spirit liked her either. The spirit seemed like maybe she had run a boarding house or something at one point and was very picky about who she allowed to live there. There was no way I would ever live there. When I was in university, I lived in an older house that was built beside a church. The house was over 100 years old, but unsure of the actual age. I lived in the basement and had a few housemates. We didn't know at the time. It was built on a cemetery. That was discovered shortly after I moved out. Weird things would happen in the house, but I'm still not sure if it was haunted or just purely coincidental. I would hear footsteps above my room late at night, and when I would ask the next day who was in the kitchen at 2 a.m, my housemates would say they never came downstairs at all. My one housemate had a cat, and the one day we were in the kitchen, the back door opened by itself and the cat walked in. I did see what I believe was a shadow figure in that house. I had a bookshelf beside my bed and had a Buddha statue on one of the top shelves. In the middle of the night, there was a huge bang, and when I woke up, I saw a black figure jump from the bookshelf to the floor and run out of the room. The shelf with the Buddha figure had fallen off the bookshelf, and the Buddha had smashed to pieces on the floor. I thought at first maybe it was my housemate's cat that had somehow knocked the shelf off. But the next morning, when I told my housemate what had happened, they said the cat had been locked in their room with them all night. Shortly after that, I moved out. The house was owned by the church, and there was a parking lot in the backyard. The church was adding an addition and had started construction and digging up the parking lot behind the house. During the construction, human remains were found, which obviously halted the construction until it was determined why the remains were there. It was found that before the house existed, a small cemetery had been on that land. At least 30 skeletons were found. I'm not sure if they were able to determine the identities or why they were buried there. For some reason, when the house was built, it was decided to build on top of the cemetery, and the records of the cemetery's existence were either lost or forgotten over time. Not sure if other housemates had experiences there. It was a creepy house, and I remember them mentioning hearing things at night and not liking to stay there alone. Unsure if it was haunted, but weird things definitely did happen there. A few years ago, I had a miscarriage. I was devastated and was grieving. My husband and I visited my in-laws one night. They lived in a rural area with few streetlights. It was a typical fall night, and we stayed at their place until around midnight. It was a clear night. No rain, no mist, no fog, just a clear, cool fall night. Since it was late and there were so few people that lived in the area, the roads were deserted. It was just us alone on the road. All of a sudden, my husband and I both saw something in the middle of the road in front of us. He slammed on the brakes at the exact same moment that I yelled, "Watch out!" In the middle of the road was what looked like a wolf or a dog. It was in the form of a white mist, but it was definitely there in front of us, and we definitely both saw it at the same moment. We had looked at each other in disbelief, and when we turned back, it had vanished. I said to him, "Did you see that too?" He described seeing a transparent white dog that appeared out of nowhere. I only saw half the dog or wolf, the front half. We had no explanation for how we both saw the same thing at the same time, or how it had vanished in thin air. We were very freaked out the rest of the way home that night. We were afraid it was some sort of bad omen, but nothing bad happened. I've often wondered if it was related to the miscarriage I had shortly before that, and was maybe a sign of some kind.
I wish I'd never moved into the city. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to be closer to work, and there's so much more to do here. In the countryside, it was a 15-minute drive to find some place to eat, and a 30-minute drive to the nearest grocery store. Nothing was ever open past 8 p.m. But here, I could leave work at 11 p.m. and find myself at a movie theatre or restaurant night across the street. I loved it. My dog, however, was less than thrilled. Shelby was a good girl, some sort of retriever, almost golden but not quite, close to a reddish brown. She had long floppy ears that would swing and sway as she ran, and a tail that never stopped wagging. But ever since we moved, she hasn't been the same. Eating less, sleeping more, sign enough for me to get worried. My concern reached new heights when she started to run away. The first night she ran, I was belligerent. I wandered through the streets trying to call her name and explain to the officer on the phone what had happened at the same time. For 3 hours I searched, only returning home because it was dark, and the police had promised me they would look for her. When I returned home that night and found her patiently waiting at my front door, I'm not ashamed to admit, I cried a little. There was no scolding, no anger, I was just happy to have her back. Then she ran away again. It became routine. Every week she would run away at least once, sometimes twice, only to return at my door a few hours later, waiting to be let inside. I scoured the house for any hole, crack, or crevice she could have been slipping out through, but found nothing. It's as if she simply turned the lock and walked out, closing the door behind her. My friends recommended a shock collar to keep her in check, but I could never do that to her, though it did give me an idea. I affixed a little GPS to her collar, the kind they sell for keeping track of cats and dogs, and waited. It didn't take long for her to run again, and I sat in my car preparing to follow her. I was stopped by a sudden realization. She's been happier, hasn't she? Ever since she started to run away, her attitude has done a 180. She sleeps less, wags her tail more, and just seems to be in a generally better mood. I figured she just needed the chance to run around and stretch her legs, but I knew that sooner or later she'd get hurt, so I started to follow the signal. As my car went from pleasantly lit streets to rolling down dark gravel alleyways, I started to sweat. What was she doing down here? I figured I'd find her at a park or someone else's yard, bothering their cat, not in some dark alley. Eventually, I reached a narrow path and had to get out of my car to travel it, shimmying past a rusted chain-link fence and onto someone's backyard. Sat surrounded by tall brick walls was a little green lot, bushes and trees around the edges with a clear, unobstructed centre. It was such an odd spot for a plot like this, like a tiny park wedged between buildings. The only way in or out was through that little chain fence. I peered past the bushes, and just beyond them in the centre of the lot, with 4 other dogs, was my Shelby. I quickly pulled out my phone and took a few pictures. It was so cute to see my dog sneaking off to play with friends, like something out of a Pixar movie. I stood, no longer trying to hide, and looked around the lot for anyone who might own the other dogs. There was nobody else around, just me and the dogs. I stepped out of the bushes towards them, and froze. Something was off. Shelby always jumps on me to greet me, but now she stood statue still, staring at me. All of them did, actually. Not a single one of them moved an inch other than their eyes, which followed me as I approached, just looking at me. Heads low to the ground, tails stiff as stone. They looked like they should have been growling, but none of them made a sound. "Shelby?" I called hesitantly, but she didn't respond. I reached out to touch her, about to pat her head, but stopped myself. I felt so sure that if I touched her then, something would happen. My gut told me to leave, but I didn't want to go without my dog. "Shelby, come on," I pleaded, but she only stared at me. I left, squeezing past the fence, getting in my car and driving home. As I drove, I thought about what I should do. She would be back, right? She always came back, always happy as can be. Would she be like that again, or would she be how she was in that alley? Maybe she just thought she was in trouble, or didn't like that I had found her secret spot, though that wasn't like her. She would be fine once she came home, I decided. I just needed to wait. Hours rolled by at a snail's pace. I tried playing video games, reading, listening to music, anything to distract myself from my thoughts, but I couldn't stop worrying about Shelby. Each tick of the clock sounded like her nails on the concrete floor outside. Every bark had me checking out the window to see if it was her coming home. Finally, around 1 a.m., I fell asleep. In my dreams, I was in the alley again, walking towards the lot. It was dark out, and I couldn't see past the fence. But as I got near, I could hear growling, and soon I saw two glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the other side, slowly rising higher and higher, until whatever they belonged to stepped over the fence and began to come towards me. I sat up on the couch, rubbing my eyes and looking around my living room. It was still dark. A look at my phone told me it was 3:01 a.m., and I sighed, standing up and preparing to go to the bedroom when I heard something. My body went stiff, ears straining to catch the sound again, eyes wide as I slowly spun, searching the room for the source of the sound. It sounded like an exhale, sharp and fast and close. I nearly jumped out of my skin when someone pounded on the front door. "Who is it?" I called as I pressed my eye to the peephole, but I saw no one, and no one answered. I waited for a long time, listening hard and staring through that hole into the night outside, when finally someone knocked again. I didn't see their face or body, but I did see their hand rise up and strike the door 3 times. I said, "Who is it?" I called again, more aggressive this time. Whoever was outside, I wanted them to think I wasn't some pushover, hoping they would leave me alone. They still didn't answer, but I began to hear movement outside the door. A scratching sound, like nails scraping against concrete. And for a moment, my eyes went wide. I dropped to my knees, pressing my cheek against the ground and checking under the door. There in front of me, sniffing hard like she just caught my scent, was the big, reddish-brown snout of a dog. My dog. I yanked the door open hard, arms already out and ready for Shelby to jump into them. But there was nothing on the other side. "Shelby?" I called out in confusion, stepping outside and looking around, seeing nothing. There's no way I imagined that. It was right there. I sighed, realizing how tired I was, how sore my eyes were, and how desperately I needed sleep. I'll go back to the alley tomorrow. She'll turn up, I thought, trying not to think about her scared and alone, wandering the night looking for me, wondering why I hadn't found her yet. I couldn't sleep. Looking through old photos helped a little. It was nice to see her running through the fields of my old home. God, I missed it. I scrolled through every picture until I got to the most recent one, the picture of her and the other dogs. Smiling, I prepared to set it down when I noticed something strange. There was a sort of pattern to the grass. I thought I was imagining it at first, but the longer I looked, the clearer I saw it. It was like something was under the grass. The lawn seemed to bulge in lines. Lines that formed in a circle around the dogs, with bits of building ground running between and around in the circle. It was easy to write off as the natural bumpy dirt under the lawn, but something felt so deliberate about it. Have you ever seen those pictures online? The ones the artists write, "The longer you look, the stranger it gets," under? I felt like I was looking at one of those. Every time my eyes wandered, I noticed something else off about the picture. 2 birds in the trees I had missed before hung dead, bits of stringy rope tied around their feet to keep them suspended in the trees. The brick walls in the background seemed to have drawings carved into their surfaces. Between the dogs, half hidden in the grass, was something red and wet. And finally, Shelby's eyes were a different colour than their usual brown. They were yellow. A knock on the door nearly made me throw my phone. I sat up slowly. Something was weird about this knock. It sounded closer. It came again, louder this time, and I felt my body start to shake like my door had when they pounded on it. Someone was in my house, and they were knocking on my bedroom door. I slowly crept out of bed, preparing to run into the bathroom and call 911, when I heard a bark from the other side of the door. I rushed to open it, stepping out into my living room and looking around. Standing in the corner of the room, obscured in shadow, was what looked like a dog. "Shelby?" I asked, voice shaking with fear. Shelby. It called back. Its voice was wobbly, pitched much too high, like I had to squeeze the words out. I froze in my tracks when it spoke and could only stare in horror as it slowly stood up on its back legs and began to step towards me. It looked like something had taken my dog's skin and stretched it over its frame, but it wasn't a very good fit. Parts of its skin sagged and hung low, while other parts were too tight, starting to tear and seep blood, along with thin, dangling appendages. Its mouth hung open, and it seemed like its true face was watching me from inside. Parts of its body seemed to be moving under the skin, pushing against it and trying to pry through it. It towered over me, at least 7 feet tall, lowering its face inches from mine and sniffing me a few times. Through Shelby's ajar mouth, I could see something moving. Something wet and dark that seemed to be stretching out towards me. Like a hand with 100 fingers, all crawling along her throat. I stepped back and slammed my bedroom door in its face, turning the lock, even though it didn't sound like it was trying to get in. It just kept saying her name over and over as I flung open my window and crawled out. The last thing I saw before I dropped to the ground was her snout pushing under the doorframe and sniffing for me. I'm at my friend's house now. I ran to the nearest gas station and had her come pick me up. I didn't tell her much, just that something was in my house and I needed a place to stay for the night. She was understanding and didn't try to pry. I'm typing this up on her laptop because I don't want to forget or convince myself it didn't happen. I know what I saw. I know something took Shelby from me.